Hello everybody, welcome to this installment of Retracing History. I'm walking on a trace of Braddock's Road, a military road built back in 1755 by a British army commanded by General Edward Braddock, whose mission was to go from Alexandria, Virginia, across the Allegheny Mountains and secure the Ohio River Valley for the British Crown. What ended up happening was his army gets defeated, and you probably know that event as Braddock's defeat today. Braddock, however, has become a term, not a name, used to describe the folly of Britain's many efforts to try to colonize North America that would ultimately end in failure at the hands of their own colonists, namely one of Braddock's staff officers, George Washington, when he'll lead the colonist rebellion against the British Empire in 1775. But I want to re-examine Braddock's campaign, because to understand George Washington and his military's prowess, you must understand where he got his education from. And that was on this road and being under the tutorship of General Edward Braddock, the man. In late summer of 1754, the kings of Britain and France were digesting the news of tensions rising between their North American colonies. Efforts by the British colony of Virginia to take possession of the Ohio River Valley were contested by French and Native American forces. Long story short, bullets were exchanged, people were killed, but only a temporary pause in the territorial dispute was achieved. In the mind of King George II, the situation had spiraled out of colonial control and necessitated intervention by the Crown. A new seat of power was created, the British Commander of North America, who would oversee future military operations on the continent. The name selected for this job was Edward Braddock. Just shy of 60 years of age at the time of appointment, he was introduced to King George II with high praise from the Duke of Cumberland. Braddock was surrounded by the military since birth, his father having been a major general attached to the Coldstream Guards. Braddock himself would be attached to the same honored unit for much of his own career. Although wealth was key in securing rank, Braddock received the short end of the stick when it came to a financial inheritance. The majority went to his sisters, one of whom squandered much of her wealth on a devious suitor, a scandal which marred the Braddock name in London gossip. Yet Braddock overcame this with a general swagger backed by solid management of the men under his charge. His decades of devotion to the British Army, including participation in 2 different conflicts, landed him the governorship of Gibraltar in 1753, putting him in the difficult position of maintaining an armed force on constant vigilance in a foreign land, where good relations with the local population were equal, if not of greater value, compared to sheer fighting fortitude. This made him the best candidate for the new office. Braddock would confer with the Duke, the King, and other key British leaders in drawing up a strategy to swiftly end the territorial crisis in North America. Braddock would lead just one in a series of British columns intent on neutralizing French encroachment upon their frontier. Success would hinge upon cooperation between the Crown, its colonies, as well as gain the trust of native tribes from the regions these British forces were destined to march through. In public, Braddock affirmed success, but in private, doubt was already manifesting. "Dear Pop, we are sent like sacrifices to the altar." In February of 1755, Braddock arrived in the colony of Virginia alongside 2 regular British Army regiments. The 44th and 48th Foot, marching through the streets of Alexandria, would have made for a spectacle few in the Old Dominion would have ever saw before. But the body of both regiments was a patchwork from across the British Isles, having been stationed across Ireland for several years, and would need to seek additional recruits from the colonies to strengthen their numbers. Braddock's army also arrived with approximately 30 pieces of artillery, ranging from Coehorn mortars to 12-pound field cannons. Although they made a striking impression upon Virginians gawking on the docks, doubts immediately arose if any of the artillery would actually be able to traverse the wilderness, let alone the whole army. So in the Fort Necessity National Battlefield, they do have another case set up for accoutrements you can expect from the Braddock campaign. On display, and we have a German's miter cap. That is actually attached to the 48th Regiment of Foot, one of the two regular units that made up the backbone of Braddock's force. You're also going to have a British hanger sword, naval boarding axe, not too dissimilar from some of the tomahawks and other hatchets you would have saw some fighters in the Ohio River Valley being equipped with. We actually have 1700s ladies' shoes and a wash tub representing the camp followers, the women that followed the army. Many of them were wives to soldiers and officers. Some were self-employed, and would have followed the army around doing various tasks such as washing and nursing duties. Doubts Braddock may have quietly withheld in London were dwarfed by the reality check he would receive at the Carlisle House. Across 2 days in April, Braddock met with representatives from the colonies of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and Massachusetts to hash out their role in the Crown's North American campaigns of 1755. It was the matter of funding for these campaigns which most upset the colonies. While Braddock was shipped off with a small purse from the Crown, it was expected that His Majesty's colonial subjects would offset the cost of their own defense. For approximately a century now, the British American colonies were largely allowed to pursue their own ambitions. Now, the Crown was instructing them on what ambition to follow.
We were requested to come and help defend the frontier against the French by the colonial governments. So His Majesty has graciously sent over these two regiments to restore that order, and the colonies were expected to contribute to the defense fund, that they were to form a common chest. And I come here, I meet with them, and I'm promptly told by the various colonial governors that no, we can't do that. We have to go and get permission from our local legislators. So I'm operating here now also with a lack of money. This is solely coming out of the British Treasury when it was supposed to be a joint venture.
While the governors and their assemblies bickered over funding, Braddock had a schedule to maintain. By May, he was busy combining all forces available to him on the western Virginia frontier. He established his base camp for the push into the Ohio River Valley at a stockade situated at the confluence of Wills Creek and the Potomac River, rechristened Fort Cumberland after the Duke. Today, what was once the heart of the fort is now the site of the Emmanuel Episcopal Church in downtown Cumberland, Maryland. However, civic leaders have strived to denote the historical significance of the church grounds and surrounding neighborhood. We have another historic sign here just beneath the church. You stand upon historic ground within the north wall of Fort Cumberland. Your location, which is marked by the X, so we're here, is shown on the diagram. Lines of barracks parallel to the street were to your front and rear along the line of white rocks in the street. The land was fairly level then, on top of a hill extending out from the church property in front of you. The fort here was a palisade work with logs stripped and pinned together and rising to a height of 12 feet. Fort Cumberland mainly served as a rallying point for expeditions against the French to the west, as well as a forward outpost and a line of frontier forts for protecting settlers from hostile Indians during the mid-18th century. Patrols went out from here to secure intelligence of French and Indian activity in the region. Some went as far as the Ohio River, of course, modern-day Pittsburgh. The fort's presence never served as much of a deterrent to Indian raids against the white settlers. It was garrisoned continuously from the winter of 1754 for 55 until abandoned in 1765. The garrison usually numbered 150 to 200 men. Some of the garrison commanders included Colonel James Innes, Colonel George Washington, Colonel Adam Stevens, and I got a whole video about his biography if you want to watch that, Major Livingston, Major General Edward Braddock, and Governor Sharp of Maryland. Because Maryland and Virginia were always at odds over who owned this land. Obviously today it's part of Maryland, but in 1750s that was very much uncertain. Virginia had claims over this, and Virginia and Maryland went back and forth over who was actually supposed to finance and provide troops to garrison this outpost. Because they would say, Maryland would say, well, it's a Virginia post. And then Virginia would say, well, actually it's a Maryland post. And then nobody would actually garrison it. And Washington's life was a nightmare, essentially, for the mid-1750s. Okay, this is starting to make sense. We were down by the church earlier, down here on the hillside. We were kind of standing around here in the middle of the barracks. And the barracks weren't actually in the fort itself. They were kind of in this addition that was put on to the east side of the fort. So we're standing here. This would have been the western curtain wall right here. So you can imagine the bastions curving. This bastion, if I could do this right, this angle is kind of right there. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense, yeah. So yeah, the fort kind of went like this, and then going down the hill, that was kind of more your barracks locations, which were not the priority of the defense. As you can see, they were not in the actual fort. And we're in front of what's called the Wills Creek Museum. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I've never heard of it before. New museum? Sounds good to me. In any case, we're kind of standing approximately where the main gate, the western gate to Fort Cumberland would have been. They have a nice sign here about some of the famous individuals who would have garrisoned Fort Cumberland over its history, such as Horatio Sharp, governor of Maryland, and at one point the commander of Fort Frederick, which we also visited. It was a stone fort, not a wooden fort. One of the only stone forts built by the British in North America. It cost a lot of money to build, but Sharp saw the native and the Franco-Amerindian raids that were happening in what was then Western Virginia, and yeah, he didn't want his fort to be burned. So yeah, he built his own in stone, learning lessons from forts around Cumberland. We've got Daniel Boone. Everybody knows about Daniel Boone. He was a teamster in Braddock's campaign and would go on the Blaze, the Wilderness Road down to Kentucky. Henry Lee. He was here as governor of Virginia and commanded forces during the Whiskey Rebellion. Light Horse Harry Lee, of course, he'd be the father of Robert E. Lee. Thomas Gage, who was then a lieutenant colonel in Braddock's army. He'd go on to become the military governor of Massachusetts, and he's the one that orders the Redcoats out to try to confiscate arms in Concord, Massachusetts on April 19th, 1775, starting the Revolutionary War. George Washington, I don't think I have to say anything more, and Edward Braddock, the general of that failed assault to try to take Fort Duquesne back in 1755. All would have been on these grounds at some point in the mid-18th century. Although Braddock and the elements of his army had rendezvoused without a major incident, it was apparent to the general the Crown had underestimated how difficult this assignment was going to be.
You've wondered why we've had some difficulties with this campaign to start with. And please allow me to look at this map here, show this map to you. This is very, very similar to one that I was shown by the Duke of Cumberland. And when you look at this map, there's several interesting things about this. Your eastern seaboard is very, very well documented. But as you move further to the west, you are starting to get less and less detail. And this has been a major problem for this whole campaign, because our campaign was based upon the fact that you had only a limited number of mountains to cross, that you're really dealing with a great unknown. One of the other problems that we're seeing with this map here also is that the scale is very misleading. Yes, we do have our north arrow, but when you look here, all of our scale is based upon degrees of latitude and longitude. So it does look like I would have only a very short distance to go from Cumberland, where we're at, to the forks of the Ohio. However, once we started leaving Alexandria and moving to the west, the problems became very noticeable, that the terrain is very broken. There's also another major problem, that this is not showing anything in terms of the vegetation that are here. I have animals. I have my oxen, I have my horses that are pulling our equipment. And as a result of this heavily wooded area, which we were not told of, there's no areas where I can pasture them. So I'm having to bring along food for them, fodder for them, and wagons that could be carrying other supplies. Also, when we came over here, we were promised that the colonies would provide us with wagons, with transport. None of them have done that. The only colony which has helped me has been a colony of Pennsylvania, and that has been largely through the good graces of Benjamin Franklin, one of your leading statesmen.
Colonial cooperation was not the only partnership Braddock needed for success. He also needed the aid of the native tribes who called the Ohio River Valley home. Several claims have been made about the general, saying that he was uninterested in gaining native support. But throughout May of 1755, records show that no less than 3 conferences were hosted by the general to appeal to tribal representatives.
I am here to restore Native Americans to their rightful land by the earlier treaties. This is specifically given to me in my orders by the Duke of Cumberland. So we are going to chase the French out of this area, restore the natives into this area, but the natives are not coming. And the question is why? And I'm here, I had gifts for them, and then I find out that as I started talking to more of the colonial officers, there's been a very long history of negative relations between the natives and the colonial governments, such that the natives are very leery of trusting anybody who is within His Majesty's government. And that has hampered me very much because I don't have the scouts that I need. I'm basically traveling blind in this territory.
Those that appeared at Fort Cumberland included representatives from the Lenape and Haudenosaunee. The latter was the same faction who had supported Virginia's failed campaign of the previous year. Since that time, they had sought refuge from French attack in the Agwick Valley of Pennsylvania. Their leader in English diplomacy was Skoroady, also referred to as Monokatufa. Skoroady was a half-king, appointed by the Haudenosaunee to protect their interests in the region. While the Greater Haudenosaunee Confederacy wished to remain neutral in this European border clash, French incursion into the Ohio Valley swayed the Confederacy's reps into taking more direct action. This evening, the Indians met at the general's tent to give their answer, which was that they were greatly obliged to the great king, their father, who had been so good as to send us all here to fight for them, and that they would all give their attendance and do what was in their power to reconnoiter the country and bring intelligence, that they were obliged to the general for his expression of concern for the loss of the half-king, our brother, and for the presents he had given them. The general told them that he was their friend and never would deceive them, after which they sung the war song, declaring the French their perpetual enemies. But for tribes like the Lenape, they were less enthusiastic. The Lenape had only come to settle the Ohio River Valley when their lands were purchased by the colony of Pennsylvania. The Haudenosaunee were open to the Lenape being brought into their confederacy for protection, but there was an uneasy feeling amongst the Lenape that it actually meant the loss of autonomy. While Braddock impressed the Haudenosaunee with his guns, the Lenape sachem Shingas appears to have been bitter over the whole situation. An English captive would later claim that this was Shingas' account of his meeting with Braddock. He applied to General Braddock and inquired what he intended to do with the land if he could drive the French and their Indians away, to which Braddock replied that the English should inhabit and inherit the land, on which Shingas asked whether the Indians that were friends to the English might not be permitted to live and trade amongst the English, on which General Braddock said that no savage should inherit the land. Braddock had also been promised by the colony of Virginia warriors from the Cherokee and Catawba nations, but none of them ever showed up at Fort Cumberland. It was yet another in a series of evils cursed upon Braddock by the Old Dominion, evils being the general's words, not mine. Perhaps the only positive addition agreeable to the general from this colony was his aide-de-camp.
One of the bright linings in this entire campaign for me has been the young men that I've had to brought onto my staff as my aides and assistants. One of the individuals was a gentleman by the name of George Washington, whom you may have known from the colony of Virginia. He's the gentleman who was originally tasked by the Virginia legislature to go up and demand that the French vacate the Ohio Valley, to which they promptly replied no. And then he met with misfortune at the Battle of Fort Necessity, as he called it, and afterwards he resigned his commission. However, when I came over, what I first wanted to do was to find somebody who actually had been in that area, that somebody that I could trust. And I'd heard about the character of Mr. Washington. I'd read his account when I was over in London. And so I extended an invitation to him to join my military family. I did this with the offices of Mr. Orr, who was also on my staff, and he's a fellow Coldstream Guardsman. So there's automatically a bond between us there. But Mr. Washington is a very interesting individual. I found him very attentive, very willing to share information. He's not afraid to say, I don't know, and he's not dogmatic in his approach, which is very, very refreshing. As I found that the younger men on my staff are much more willing to listen and to offer advice, but not demand their advice be taken, much like what I'm seeing with my older senior officers here. So that actually has caused a bit of a divide in my staff between my younger officers and that I listen to and my older officers that I listen to as well. And also, I find that he's a very delightful gentleman. He wishes to go and make the military a career, and so I've basically kind of taken him under my wing, so to speak, and have been working with him on areas such as how do you actually command an army? What are the issues involved? An army is more than just men. It involves the logistics and the planning, and he has a definite ability to handle that. And like I said, he's not afraid to ask if he has a question. He's not afraid to say, I don't know, can you explain this to me? Which is very, very refreshing.
Despite the chafe the presence of British regulars made with both the colonies and the tribes, Braddock was undaunted. On May 29, 1755, he began the advance out of Fort Cumberland toward Fort Duquesne, the French outpost at the forks of the Ohio River. The total army at this point had crested 2,000 in number. In addition to the 44th and 48th afoot, there were also detachments of independent companies from New York and South Carolina. The Royal Navy even contributed a small detachment of seamen. Virginia, while evil to extract funds from, had yielded several companies of colonists for use as rangers, wagoneers, artificers, and light horse. But from the numerous native conferences, only 8 warriors joined Braddock on his initial advance, including Scarrow 80. Together, they began their advance across the Allegheny Mountains, where the real trouble for Braddock would begin. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the episode. But we are not done with General Braddock's road to defeat. You saw the part 1 in the title. So, this is the part of a multi-part series we're going to be exploring throughout July 2025 of General Braddock's doomed campaign to take Fort Duquesne. So be sure to be subscribed here to the channel so you're the first notified when the next installment comes out. Be sure to hit the like button to let the TubeU algorithm know you do want to use social media to get edumericated. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting us, you can go to our Ko-fi page. Link is in the description below. You can join Readout Productions membership program, The Garrison. And special thanks to one of our Garrison members, Robert Friedman, who is portraying General Braddock in this episode as well as the next couple videos coming up soon. I'd also like to thank the Braddock's Battlefield History Center for allowing us to film on location for the Braddock segments. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.